They say Starfleet was never meant for war. It began as a promise that exploration could be its own defense. But every century brings its trials, and the Federation has faced them all. From the 12 ships that carried its banner to the 1,000 that would one day fight beneath it, Starfleet's fleet has evolved with every threat, every discovery, and every loss. This is the story of that evolution, of how many ships were actually out there, exploring, forced to learn, forced to fight, and how the Federation's soul endured, even when the stars turned hostile. Reconstructing Starfleet's size during the 23rd and 24th centuries is an exercise in educational estimation. The historical record is incomplete. Scattered reports, log fragments, and the occasional passing reference are all that remain. The most famous clue comes from Captain James T. Kirk himself, who once remarked that there were 12 Constitution-class starships in the fleet. But that quote gives us a fixed point, not the full picture. Historians interpret such fragments using a method known as multiplier analysis, a combination of contextual reasoning and probability modeling. In this case, we rely on three primary multipliers: canon, operational, and visibility. The canon multiplier gives us the official number, what was stated or recorded at the time. But canon alone is rarely complete. Even in real history, navies don't always publish their true counts, and not every ship leaves a record. So we apply the operational multiplier, which adjusts for how many of those ships would realistically be active. In most real-world fleets, 60 to 70% of vessels are mission-ready at any given time. The rest are in refit, on reserve, or under maintenance. For Starfleet, a peacetime service devoted to exploration, a 65% readiness rate provides a reasonable average. Finally, there's the visibility multiplier, which accounts for what we see versus what actually exists, or would exist. It's a concept historians use constantly when reconstructing ancient and modern militaries alike. In Earth's Second World War, for instance, historians know that only a fraction of ships were ever photographed or directly observed, yet production records reveal several times more. This is due to budgetary and narrative limitations in historical records, or in this case, the archives we have access to don't define the reality of Starfleet's operational scale. When we combine these multipliers, a clearer picture emerges. As an example, the Constitution class was the jewel of Starfleet. 12 built, but only 7 to 8 active in any one time, once refits and losses are considered. The remaining ships were likely rotating through space dock, training assignments, or long-range refits. They were explorers first, ambassadors second, and only warriors when diplomacy failed. If we continue on with this methodology, we take a look at the Miranda class, which supported them. Smaller, sturdier, and far more numerous. Though rarely mentioned by name, the visibility correction suggests there were around 41 in total. Of those, 30 were active, 6 likely in dry dock, 2 in reserve, and 2 to 3 lost to accidents or frontier engagements. They were Federation's unglamorous lifeline: supply ships, patrol escorts, and survey vessels that made the frontier habitable. The Excelsior class was just beginning its life near the end of this era. Only 2 to 3 hulls existed, with 1 active, 1 refitting, and none yet destroyed. The ship was still a prototype, its trans-warp experiments years from bearing fruit. A final group of testbed cruisers and experimental platforms rounded out the numbers. About 13 vessels existed in this category. 8 active, 2 in refit, 1 in reserve, and 1 or 2 lost during trial runs. They rarely ventured beyond safe space, serving as research craft for Starfleet's engineers. Altogether, the picture that emerges is a modest one. About 46 to 47 ships actively serving, with another 15 rotating through refit or reserve. It wasn't a vast fleet, but it was deliberate, built for diplomacy and discovery, not domination. These modest numbers perfectly reflect Starfleet's founding doctrine: defensive exploration. The Federation didn't need hundreds of warships to project strength. It needed a few shining symbols of what strength could mean. Every Constitution-class cruiser represented not a weapon, but an ideal. That curiosity could be a shield, and understanding could prevent war better than firepower ever could. The early fleet was small because it was designed to be small. It existed to explore, not to occupy, to defend peace by proving that peace could endure. And for nearly a century, it did. What began as a frontier organization of a few dozen starships had become a vast, interstellar network stretching across hundreds of worlds. But with that growth came a new challenge. How do you measure the size of a fleet built as much for peace as for protection? Unlike the 23rd century, this era offers more consistent records. Ship registries seen on screen, construction logs in canon, and mission reports that survived. Even so, no single document or episode lists the fleet's full strength. In this period, the canon multiplier becomes easier to anchor thanks to known production figures and design timelines. Starfleet shipbuilding was centralized at Utopia Planitia, Antares, and the Copernicus yards, allowing a relatively steady output rate. Still, the operation multiplier remains much the same, roughly 65% active at any given time, with the remainder cycling through maintenance or reassignment. The visibility multiplier, however, shifts upward. With more surviving records and more documented engagements, historians, if we want to call ourselves that, apply a factor of 1.5 to 2, meaning for every ship seen or referenced, there were likely one or two additional hulls of the same class, if not more, operating quietly elsewhere. Through these methods, a picture of Starfleet on the eve of the Dominion War begins to form. Not yet a military superpower, but the largest exploratory and humanitarian fleet in Federation history. At the top stood the Galaxy-class starship, the Federation's flagship and symbol of unity. A total of 13 of them were likely built, with 9 of them likely being active, 2 in maintenance, 1 on standby, and at least 1 lost. Each was a city in space, equipped for science, diplomacy, and crisis response, the logical extension of the Constitution's legacy. Alongside them operated the Nebula class, a more modular cousin designed for flexibility and lower cost. 57 were constructed, 40 in active duty, 10 in dry dock, 2 on reserve, and up to 5 destroyed during the decade's deep space incidents. Their interchangeable modules allowed them to shift from survey to combat within days. The first sign that Starfleet's peaceful intent was quietly being tempered by practicality. The Ambassador class, though aging, remained a capable mid-range cruiser. Of 51 produced, 35 were active, 10 refitting, 10 on reserve, and probably 4 lost. They were a bridge between eras, slower than the Galaxy, but still vital to patrol and diplomatic missions in frontier sectors. Meanwhile, the Excelsior class had transformed from experiment to institution. By this era, 500 likely existed, 250 active, 100 in refit, 40 in reserve, and 20 missing or destroyed. No longer experimental, they were now the backbone of Starfleet, the vessel every officer served on at least once in their career. The vessel that admirals and the diplomatic corps alike wanted to be on. And at the heart of the Federation's day-to-day operations was the tireless Miranda class. More than 300 were still in service, with 150 active, 80 refitting, 30 on reserve, and 20 or more lost. They filled every logistical niche: patrol, convoy escort, planetary survey, and relief duty. If the Galaxy class was Starfleet's soul, the Miranda was its heartbeat. Altogether, these numbers point to a fleet of roughly 900 to 1,000 operational vessels, with just under 500 active at any point. A vast organization built not for conquest, but for connection. This was Starfleet at its most confident. For nearly a century, Peace had held, and the doctrine of defensive exploration had measured into policy. Starfleet no longer needed to prove that it could defend the Federation. It had become the Federation's greatest instrument of outreach. Its ships charted the unknown, brokered peace, and carried humanitarian aid across hundreds of systems. The numbers might seem high, but the intent remained the same: strength through understanding. The fleet was large because the galaxy had grown larger, not because the Federation sought to dominate it, but because it believed knowledge could hold the peace longer than fear ever could. When the Dominion came through the wormhole, Starfleet's philosophy of peaceful expansion collapsed overnight. For more than a century, the fleet had been designed to explore, not to fight. But the new enemy demanded something else entirely. The Federation had no choice but to mobilize everything it had built for peace and turn it into an engine of war. If historians were trying to reconstruct this period, they'd rely on the same analytical methods used for earlier centuries. But the data here is richer. We have more combat reports, both on-screen and in-canon resources. Loss registers actually exist, and confirmed fleet movements. The picture that emerges is staggering. By the height of the Dominion War, Starfleet fielded more ships than at any other time in its history, and you can see it in the numbers. The Galaxy class, once the Federation's symbol of exploration, now served as a heavy command cruiser. A total of 30 were built, with 15 active, 3 in refit, 1 on reserve, likely near Earth, and 2 destroyed. No longer diplomatic vessels, they became frontline carriers of morale, proof that the Federation still stood. The Sovereign class, which did exist during the Dominion War, was Starfleet's newest and most advanced design, but still rare. From what I could tell, only 5 existed in total, 3 likely active, 1 being refit, and 1 in reserve. Their advanced systems made them too valuable to risk recklessly, so they served as flagships in key theaters, representing the Federation's technological edge rather than its numbers. The Nebula class matured into a dependable line ship. 100 hulls served during the war, 50 active, 20 in dry dock, 5 in reserve, and 5 destroyed. Versatile and modular, they acted as rapid response platforms, able to reconfigure for patrol, assault, or relief operations in days. The Intrepid class, though still new, proved its worth immediately. Of 40 constructed, 30 were active, 5 in refit, 3 on reserve, and 2 lost. The speed and range made them ideal for reconnaissance, deep strike missions, and evacuation runs. The compact Defiant class became the emblem of war: small, vicious, and relentlessly efficient. Only 20 existed if we're using the models and not what was said off camera, but 15 fought actively, 3 refitted, 1 stayed on reserve, and 1 was likely destroyed. They were the spearhead of the Federation's counter-offensives, ships that embodied everything Starfleet had once resisted building. The Akira class filled the void between heavy cruiser and escort. 80 were produced, 50 active, 15 in refit, 5 assigned to training, and 10 destroyed. Fast, durable, and heavily armed, they became the backbone of the task force formations. The venerable Excelsior class endured as the workhorse of the fleet. Even a century after its debut, 500 would still exist: 300 active, 100 in constant refit, 50 in reserve, and 50 or more destroyed. They weren't the most advanced ships in the war, but they were reliable, and reliability wins battles. And then there was the Miranda class, the old veteran that refused to die. 600 served during the conflict, with 350 active, 100 on constant repairs, 40 in training, and 80 or more lost. They performed every role imaginable: escort, transport, medical relief, and sometimes suicide defense. If the Dominion War had a silent hero, it was the Miranda. Altogether, Starfleet's wartime strength reached around 1,375 ships, with over 800 active, and around 150 lost by the war's end. It was the largest mobilization the Federation had ever attempted, and it came at an immense cost. Each destroyed vessel represented thousands of lives, and each surviving ship carried the scars of a war the Federation had never wanted to fight. The Dominion War forced Starfleet to redefine what defense meant. The doctrine of defensive exploration didn't die, it evolved. Exploration was no longer about mapping stars, it was about ensuring there would still be a Federation left to explore them. Starfleet fought the only way it knew how, by protecting life wherever it could, offering surrender instead of annihilation, and remembering, even in battle, why it had once chosen to build ships that carried scientists instead of soldiers. In victory, Starfleet didn't celebrate its strength. It mourned what it had become, and quietly began rebuilding, hoping the next generation of ships could once again sail under a banner of peace. From the 12 ships of the Constitution era to the 1,000-plus vessels of the Dominion War, Starfleet's evolution mirrors the Federation itself. Idealistic, unyielding, and forever learning what it means to defend peace without becoming the enemy that it fears. In every era, its guiding principle endured: explore boldly, defend reluctantly, and never forget why the stars were worth reaching for in the first place.